A Filipino nurse with 20 years of experience discovers her dream job offer in Germany has been revoked overnight. A businessman finds his European visa application rejected despite meeting every requirement. Across 12 nations, Filipino citizens are facing unprecedented travel restrictions, work permit denials, and residence complications that seem to have emerged from nowhere. But this isn't random bureaucratic chaos. This is something far more calculated and disturbing. The numbers tell a story that mainstream media won't touch. In the first quarter of 2025 alone, Filipino visa approval rates have plummeted by 60% across key Western nations. Immigration offices from London to Sydney are implementing new quotas that specifically target Filipino applicants. Meanwhile, countries that previously rolled out red carpets for Filipino workers are now citing vague security concerns and economic priorities to justify what appears to be systematic exclusion. Before we dive deeper into this shocking revelation, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what we're about to uncover international relations changes. What makes this situation particularly bewildering is that it's happening to one of the world's most globally integrated populations. Filipinos have built the infrastructure of the Gulf states, staffed the hospitals of America and Europe, sailed the merchant fleets of the world, and provided domestic care for millions of families across continents. They speak English fluently, adapt quickly to new cultures, and have historically been welcomed as model migrants. So why are doors suddenly slamming shut? The first clue lies in what happened in Singapore during the final months of 2024. Filipino domestic workers, who had formed the backbone of the city-state's household economy for decades, began receiving termination notices en masse. The official explanation cited new labor market priorities and skills requirements. But leaked internal documents from Singapore's Ministry of Manpower revealed a different story entirely. The real reason was a coordinated response to what officials privately called the Manila incident, a diplomatic confrontation that never made international headlines, but sent shockwaves through regional government circles. The Manila incident began when Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. made an unexpected announcement during a routine economic summit. Speaking to a room full of international investors, Marcos declared that the Philippines would no longer participate in what he termed exploitative labor export programs. Filipino workers, he stated, would receive the same wages and protections abroad as local workers, or the Philippines would restrict their deployment entirely. The statement seemed like political grandstanding until government officials began implementing actual policies to back up these words. Within weeks, the Philippine Overseas Employment Administration started rejecting contracts that didn't meet new minimum wage standards. Filipino workers bound for Saudi Arabia found their deployments canceled because employers refused to match local salary scales. Domestic workers heading to Hong Kong had their contracts frozen pending wage negotiations that would triple their compensation. The ripple effects reached every corner of the global labor market. But here's where the story takes a darker turn. Instead of negotiating fairly or acknowledging the legitimate concerns about worker exploitation, receiving countries began implementing what international law experts are calling retaliatory immigration policies. These weren't announced with fanfare or explained in press conferences. They emerged as subtle changes to visa processing times, new documentary requirements that seemed designed to fail, and immigration interview processes that became increasingly hostile to Filipino applicants. Australia led this quiet retaliation campaign. The Department of Home Affairs introduced new skill migration pathways that theoretically remained open to all nationalities, but included criteria that specifically disadvantaged Filipino applicants. Professional qualifications from Philippine universities, previously recognized without question, suddenly required additional verification processes that could take months or years. English language requirements were raised to levels that excluded even native speakers if they couldn't afford expensive certification exams. Canada followed with its own version of bureaucratic warfare. The Provincial Nominee Program, which had been a pathway for thousands of Filipino workers to gain permanent residence, began rejecting applications based on nebulous labor market assessments. Filipino nurses, desperately needed in Canadian hospitals, found themselves caught in processing delays that stretched indefinitely whilst applicants from other countries moved through the system normally. The United Kingdom implemented perhaps the most sophisticated exclusion mechanism. The new Global Talent Visa Scheme, launched with promises of attracting the world's brightest minds, included cultural integration assessments that seemed specifically designed to challenge Filipino applicants. Questions about British social norms, historical knowledge requirements, and interview processes conducted by panels with clear cultural biases created barriers that were impossible to quantify, but devastatingly effective. Germany's response was more direct, but equally damaging. The country's Blue Card program for skilled professionals began requiring sponsorship from German employers, but German companies mysteriously stopped sponsoring Filipino applicants. When questioned, employers cited concerns about cultural fit and communication styles, euphemisms that barely concealed discriminatory hiring practices backed by unofficial government guidance. New Zealand took a different approach, implementing points-based immigration systems that seemed neutral on paper but created systematic disadvantages for Filipino applicants. Age requirements, education evaluation systems, and work experience recognition processes all tilted against applicants from the Philippines, whilst favoring those from countries that hadn't challenged the global labor exploitation system. The Gulf states, traditional destinations for millions of Filipino workers, responded with their own form of economic warfare. The United Arab Emirates began requiring Filipino workers to post bonds equivalent to 2 years' salary before beginning employment. Saudi Arabia implemented new quotas that limited Filipino workers to specific sectors whilst opening doors wider for workers from countries that hadn't demanded fair wages. Qatar delayed processing for Filipino construction workers whilst fast-tracking applications from other Asian nations. Even unexpected countries joined this coordinated response. Japan, which had been actively courting Filipino caregivers and technical workers, suddenly discovered bureaucratic obstacles that made Filipino applications significantly more complex than those from other countries. South Korea's industrial visa programs began favoring applicants from Vietnam and Indonesia whilst creating new hurdles for Filipino workers. The most disturbing aspect of this coordinated campaign is its deniability. No government has explicitly banned Filipino migrants or announced discriminatory policies. Instead, they've created systems that appear neutral but function as effective exclusion mechanisms. Immigration lawyers across these countries report identical patterns. Filipino clients face longer processing times, higher rejection rates, and more intensive scrutiny than applicants from other countries with similar qualifications. The human cost of this diplomatic war is becoming apparent in communities across the Philippines. Families who had planned to reunite abroad find themselves separated indefinitely. Students who had secured university places discover their student visas are delayed or denied. Skilled professionals watch opportunities disappear, not because they lack qualifications, but because their nationality has become a liability. Filipino recruitment agencies, which had built billion-dollar businesses connecting workers with international opportunities, are watching their client base evaporate. Agencies that specialized in placing nurses in American hospitals, engineers in Canadian firms, or domestic workers in Middle Eastern households report that placement numbers have collapsed by 80% in just 6 months. The economic implications extend far beyond individual stories of disappointment and separation. The Philippines receives over $30 billion annually in remittances from overseas workers, money that supports millions of families and drives significant portions of the national economy. If current trends continue, these remittance flows could decline dramatically, creating economic hardship that reaches every level of Philippine society. But the story becomes even more complex when we examine the Philippines' response to this coordinated exclusion campaign. Rather than backing down from his demands for fair treatment of Filipino workers, President Marcos has doubled down on policies that prioritize domestic development over labor export. The Philippine government has launched massive infrastructure projects designed to create employment opportunities at home while simultaneously negotiating with countries like China, Russia, and India to create new pathways for Filipino workers that bypass traditional Western destinations. The geopolitical implications are staggering. The Philippines, a key American ally in Southeast Asia, is being pushed toward closer relationships with countries that Washington considers strategic rivals. Chinese companies are offering contracts to Filipino workers that not only match Western wages but exceed them. Russian energy companies are recruiting Filipino engineers for projects across Central Asia and Africa. Indian technology firms are creating partnerships with Philippine universities that could redirect the next generation of Filipino talent away from Western markets. This shift represents more than just labor market adjustments. It's a fundamental realignment of global migration patterns that could reshape international relations for decades. The countries that are excluding Filipino workers today may find themselves facing critical labor shortages tomorrow, whilst their strategic competitors benefit from access to one of the world's most skilled and adaptable workforces. The irony is particularly sharp in sectors where Filipino workers have become indispensable. American hospitals that relied on Filipino nurses during the COVID-19 pandemic are now facing staffing shortages as visa restrictions make it nearly impossible to recruit from the Philippines. European elderly care systems, built around Filipino caregivers, are struggling to find alternative workers who combine the language skills, cultural adaptability, and professional competence that Filipino workers provided. Meanwhile, countries that are welcoming Filipino workers with open arms are reaping enormous benefits. China's Belt and Road Initiative has become a major employer of Filipino engineers, architects, and project managers. Middle Eastern countries that compete with the Gulf states are offering better conditions to attract Filipino workers away from traditional destinations. Even African nations are beginning to recognize the value of Filipino expertise in healthcare, education, and infrastructure development. The technological dimension of this story adds another layer of complexity. The Philippines has become a major player in the global digital economy, with Filipino freelancers, developers, and digital marketers serving clients worldwide. But visa restrictions are making it difficult for Filipino tech workers to attend conferences, meet clients, or establish the personal relationships that drive business growth. This digital isolation could have long-term consequences for the Philippines' position in the global knowledge economy. Educational exchanges have also become casualties of this diplomatic conflict. Filipino students who had secured scholarships or admissions to universities in restricting countries find themselves unable to obtain student visas. Academic partnerships between Philippine institutions and Western universities are being quietly terminated. Research collaborations that have flourished for decades are ending as visa problems make academic mobility impossible. The cultural impact may prove equally significant. Filipino communities abroad, built over generations of migration, are finding themselves cut off from new arrivals who would have maintained cultural connections and provided fresh perspectives. These diaspora communities, which had served as bridges between the Philippines and host countries, are beginning to lose their vitality as immigration restrictions prevent natural renewal. You're clearly engaged with this deep dive into international power politics, so why not make it official? Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss when we expose the hidden stories that shape our world. What makes this situation particularly dangerous for the countries implementing these restrictions is that they're creating exactly the kind of brain drain reversal that could undermine their own competitiveness. Filipino workers who would have contributed to American hospitals, Canadian schools, Australian businesses, and European social services are instead channeling their talents toward countries that welcome their contributions. The long-term economic and social costs of this policy choice may far exceed any short-term diplomatic satisfaction. The Philippines itself is undergoing a transformation that could make this exclusion campaign ultimately counterproductive. Government investments in education, technology, and infrastructure are creating domestic opportunities that make overseas employment less attractive to skilled workers. The country's young population, high English literacy rates, and growing technological sophistication position it to become a major player in the global economy regardless of Western immigration policies. Regional partnerships are also providing alternatives to traditional migration patterns. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations has created new mobility frameworks that allow Filipino workers to move freely within the region. South-South cooperation initiatives are opening pathways to countries in Africa, Latin America, and other parts of Asia that were previously unexplored by Filipino workers. The private sector response has been equally dramatic. International companies that depend on Filipino talent are relocating operations to countries where they can continue accessing this workforce. Technology firms are establishing development centers in the Philippines rather than trying to bring Filipino workers to Silicon Valley. Healthcare companies are creating training programs in Manila rather than recruiting trained nurses for Western hospitals. As we move deeper into 2025, the outlines of a new global labor landscape are becoming clear. The traditional patterns of South-North migration that defined the post-war era are giving way to more complex, multipolar flows that reflect shifting economic and political realities. The Philippines finds itself at the center of this transformation, forced to adapt, but potentially positioned to benefit from new opportunities that arise as old systems collapse. The question facing both the Philippines and the countries that are restricting Filipino migration is whether this current crisis will lead to a more equitable global labor system or simply create new forms of exploitation and inequality. The answer will depend partly on policy choices made in capitals from Manila to Washington, but also on the actions of millions of individuals who are navigating this changing landscape while pursuing their own dreams of better lives for themselves and their families. The story of 12 countries slamming doors on Filipinos in 2025 isn't just about immigration policy or diplomatic tensions. It's about the fundamental question of whether the global economy can continue to function on the basis of systematic exploitation of certain populations, or whether demands for dignity and fair treatment will force a more equitable distribution of opportunities and rewards. The Philippines may have triggered this crisis by demanding better treatment for its citizens, but the resolution will determine the shape of international relations for decades to come. What we're witnessing isn't just a temporary diplomatic spat or a cyclical adjustment in migration patterns. This is a fundamental challenge to the post-colonial economic order that has structured global labor flows since the mid-20th century. The countries that are restricting Filipino migration today are essentially defending a system that allowed them to access skilled labor at below-market prices whilst avoiding the social and economic costs of training and retaining domestic workforces. The Philippines' refusal to continue participating in this exploitative system represents something unprecedented in post-war international relations, a labor-exporting country with sufficient economic and political confidence to demand fair treatment for its citizens. This precedent terrifies governments that depend on exploitative migration systems to maintain their competitive advantages and social stability. As this story continues to unfold throughout 2025, one thing is certain. The old assumptions about global labor mobility are dead. What emerges from this crisis will determine whether we move toward a more just and equitable international system, or whether new forms of exploitation and exclusion replace the old ones. The 12 countries slamming doors on Filipinos today may discover that they've locked themselves out of the future they thought they were protecting.